Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are talking on a subject that we don't often talk about very much here. We're going to talk a little bit about religion, particularly Buddhism. Proven Paradox and Nicholas Haidt have their own podcast called Bright on Buddhism. And Nick is a student of Eastern religion. That's what he's doing his graduate work in. And today we're going to talk all about Buddhism and its effects on culture, religion, its perspectives on life. And we're going to talk about suffering, compassion, the life of the Buddha, all this sort of thing. So it's a very interesting conversation. It's a bit wide ranging. This is an hour-long conversation. So if you're interested in Buddhism or interested in religion, this is a great conversation. Nick is a wonderful expert. I ask a few questions and he just kind of goes and talks and expands. So if you want to visit their podcast, links are in the description. Otherwise, this is Proven Paradox and Nick Haidt on Buddhism. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. Let's go. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast. Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am joined by a couple of very special guests with a very special and odd topic. We don't usually talk very much about religion around here. News and politics is more of our jam, but I thought this would be an interesting opportunity to talk to two people about a very interesting subject, and also to give them a chance to kind of try out podcasting as a form, all this type of thing. So this is one of the things where when you sign up to, subscribe to my podcast, sometimes we take little side detours. We go on little journeys and adventures. This is one such journey and adventure. So I would like to welcome Proven Paradox and Nicholas Haidt to the Cameron Journal podcast. And today we're going to talk a little bit about, of all things, if you can imagine, Buddhism. Welcome, guys. How are you?
Thanks for having us on. Doing great.
Excellent. So here's the thing. I didn't really get clear on exactly what we were going to talk about, how this was going to work, all this type of thing, which is both an indictment of my show prep abilities and possibly the broadness of the topic. So why don't you give us a little rundown of what you guys want to talk about, what your thoughts are about this. Give us the shape of the journey, and then we'll see where it takes us.
Sure. Nick, you want to start?
Yeah, so I guess I can start by giving you kind of the format of our podcast and how we run it and what we do. So what we do is we take listener submitted questions about Buddhism, and I try and bring my scholarship about East Asian Buddhism to bear in answering those questions in as accurate and faithful to the scriptures way as I possibly can. I'm a graduate student in East Asian languages and cultures with a specialization in Japanese Buddhism. And so I'm around this stuff a lot. And oftentimes I'm called on by my department to teach about it at the collegiate level. And so what interests me about the forum kind of and the platform that we use for the podcast is people can find information that's accurate and faithful and not really polluted by new agey self-helpy stuff about Buddhism if they're interested in it, and they can do so for free. I had to pay a lot of money to learn about Buddhism at a university, and it's a religion, and religion is for everybody and for nobody. So I kind of was hoping to spread the audience and to bring it all down from the university level if people were interested in engaging with it on that level. And that's kind of the mission of the podcast. And so far, Proven Paradox's role is as the resident skeptic. He kind of keeps me in the real world and asks questions that make it make sense to somebody who isn't so deeply steeped in Buddhist studies as I am. And he serves as an audience stand-in as well, asking questions and asking for clarification and participating in the discussion as someone who is interested in Buddhism and has read about Buddhism before, but may or may not be an expert yet. And through the course of the episodes, we kind of learn together and discuss these things and see if we can figure them out in some sort of meaningful way.
For my
Excellent.
part, hello,
Yeah.
I'm Docs, just to help folks get the voices clear. And my role is, I've said sidekick before, but I've also said willing victim before. We were talking about that in our most recent recording, I think, where my part is to come in as the person who doesn't know this already and go, wait a minute, I don't understand this part, or this seems weird, or like pick apart things and try to get at the core of them. I also do the editing after we're done with the recording.
Well, excellent. That sounds like a very interesting, very sort of democratic approach to this whole thing. So, why don't you give us a basic sketch then of what is Buddhism? Where did it come from? Why is it become so popular in the West? Give us a kind of a basic grounding. Yeah.
So Buddhism is a religion that starts out in northwestern/northern India in around 500s BC with the teachings of this guy named Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha Gautama was born as a prince of this region, and he lived a very privileged and very ritzy, very rich life. And the reason for that was that his father, the king, was sheltering him from the real world. The reason he was being sheltered was because upon Siddhartha's birth, it was prophesied that he would either become a great king, which is what his father wanted, or a great spiritual teacher. For those of you that know the end of this story, the latter is what actually happens. So over the course of his life, of his youth, he never leaves the palace, and he has every sensory thing attended to, every sensory desire, physical desire, hunger, thirst, everything attended to hand and foot by everybody in the palace. And he kind of gets dissatisfied with this life, and he leaves the palace. And on the occasions that he leaves the palace, he witnesses things that his father was trying to protect him from, particularly aging, illness, death, and spiritual pursuit. He sees an old person and he wonders to himself, will this one day happen to me? And finds out that it will. He sees a sick person and he says, does this happen to everybody? And he finds out, yes, it does. And he sees a dead person and asks, am I one day going to die? And someone says, yes. And then in the midst of that same encounter, he sees a spiritual ascetic, someone who's meditating and fasting and doing spiritual practices to try and reach some higher truth or state. And that inspires him to leave the palace to try and defeat aging, illness, and death. So he tries out a few different things and still is not quite satisfied. And then he decides that he's going to sit under a Bodhi tree, which is so named because of him, because of awakening, which is the root word of both his title Buddha and of Bodhi, the tree name. He's going to sit under this tree and meditate until he defeats desire, aging, illness, death, etc. And he's going to defeat it or die trying. And so after 49 days of this meditation, he finally reaches enlightenment. And then he goes on to preach what are now the sutras. And these sutras go on to be passed down orally for many centuries, but then around the turn of the millennium, these sermons are recorded and written down and copied and spread all throughout East Asia. To date, now there are about 300 million Buddhists in the world, self-reporting Buddhists in the world, many of them in East Asia, but also all over the world. And it's become quite popular in the West, especially in the last, I would say, 40 to 50 years, with Japan entering the world stage after World War II. once they became part of Western culture and Western discourse after the end of World War II, a lot of Buddhist thinkers and scholars began writing in English about Buddhism and trying to kind of present it in the West as a philosophy rather than a religion. And there are some problems with this, but it's led to the kind of increase in popularity that has to do with Buddhism, especially among people who are thinking of themselves as spiritual rather than religious. Maybe they're not super hardcore Christian or Jewish or Muslim or something else, but they're interested in spirituality, individual types of faith and religion. And so they gravitate towards Buddhism because the Buddha is not a god. He's not regarded as an omnipotent creator. He's regarded as a being that is worth respect and as, the one who has brought the teaching to all of us, but not as one who is responsible for the rain and the mountains and the earth and all these other things. So now Buddhism is quite popular, but unfortunately for us, it kind of got diluted with the self-help new agey stuff. And it also struggled from translations issues. Because we're working with East Asian languages, they're very distantly related to ours. And so translating them in a way that makes sense and is faithful to the concepts is quite difficult. There may not be a English word with one single corresponding Sanskrit word or Chinese word or Japanese word. And so because of the interpretations that have happened in these translations, there are some misconceptions about Buddhism that we try to debunk with this podcast.
That was an excellent overview of all of it. That is a lot. So many questions. Let's start from the beginning. And I think this is something that I think Buddhism is well known for, and I think it's a word that has been horribly misused. But how would you define enlightenment in the Buddhist sense?
Yeah, I'd be happy to give my overview of the different definitions of the word, and then I'd love to hear what Docs has to say about this as well. Enlightenment is typically regarded in Buddhism, for those in Buddhism who are steeped in it, as the attainment of omniscience. So someone who has become enlightened, they understand the true nature of reality according to universal laws such as impermanence and emptiness and other things that we discuss quite in depth in the podcast. And they also understand people's own infinite rebirths in the past and future, and their own karmic history, their own karma, their own moral and ethical sort of trajectory in the universe. And they also understand the true nature of the universe. They understand answers to questions, those who are enlightened, like, is there an afterlife? Is this universe the only universe, etc.? There's lots of different accounts as to the answers to those questions, but all Buddhists agree that someone who is enlightened knows the answers to them, whatever those answers may be.
So for my part, the thing to add there is that most of the time in Buddhism, based on what I've found from doing this podcast, there's usually not just one answer to that question. So like the question comes down to like, there's Buddhas, there's Bodhisattvas, there's Arhats, there's the Pratyeka Buddhas, all of these people, like there are so many different ways to come at enlightenment that it's hard to really wrap up. It's something that requires study to get an idea of what we're talking about. But this is my whole part in this has been the person who's here to learn. So in a way, this is working towards one's own enlightenment. I like the, I'm sorry, I'm stumbling here. It's enlightenment is something to strive for mainly. It's not something that can be described in words. And it's something that is just hard to define, which is why I'm stumbling so much.
That said, I agree with your assessment of it being something that Buddhists are striving for and being ineffable. Many, if not all, Buddhists agree that you can't really describe it to somebody. You can't really put it into words effectively. And so I fully echo what you said there. That all fits in perfectly.
It's like trying to describe the color blue to someone who's colorblind. It's what words can you use to describe the color blue to somebody who's never seen it before?
No, that certainly makes sense, especially in a spiritual context. A lot of these things are things that can only be experienced, not necessarily talked about or passed on verbally. In this strain of things that have been overused in our society and are therefore poorly defined. When it comes to karma, there's that is a word that has been overused, applied to so many things. The concept has become, incredibly loose throughout the zeitgeist of our culture. And I don't think people understand that, this is it's not a kind of a grand ledger sheet kept by the universe who's totting up, it's not Santa Claus, keeping a list of who's naughty or nice. It's much more fluid. It's much more back and forth. So why don't you give us a grounding in what the actual concept of karma is and how it actually works as opposed to how pop culture would indicate that it works?
Yeah. So I think that the way that we think of karma nowadays is what goes around comes around. And that's not entirely wrong. The idea is that if you act good, then good circumstances come out of it. And if you act bad, bad circumstances come out of it. But it's not so individual as that. And it's also not so instantaneous as that. Karma includes everybody else. So in Buddhism, there is the teaching of non-self or emptiness, which is that there is no soul. There's no component of the human existence that exists substantially and unchangingly and persistently over the course of an eternity. Nobody has that. Nothing has that. And that being the case, it's no longer a discussion of my karma or your karma. Rather, it's more like our shared karma or our connected karma. Now, of course, if I'm the one that acts badly, then I'm the one who takes retribution for it. But my acting badly can create bad circumstances for you, which then can cause you to act badly and then incur bad karma for yourself. So it's more like the reflexivity of the universe. That's how I describe it in our episode about karma, is that everything that you do, it doesn't just end as it is. It goes on to become the cause and condition for something else to happen, for someone else to do something. And so karma is morality and ethics in the very simplest form in Buddhism, but it's also speaking to the fact that actions have consequences, and consequences themselves cause actions to happen, which then also have consequences. So it's morality that depends on causality, and it depends on intention, and it depends on everything that interacts with circumstance and cause, and with the action that someone does and the person that does them. And all of that culminates into your position in the universe. If you're going to be reborn in a better circumstance or a worse circumstance. And I would also go on to say that karma is what is meant to be transcended in Buddhism. So karma does not make you become enlightened. Enlightenment is actually the transcendence of karma. So you're no longer acting karmically whenever you become enlightened. And you're no longer acting in a good or bad way. You've kind of transcended good and bad, and you've transcended neutral as well. So it's beyond morality and ethics in a sense.
I would also add that it's important to note, especially for somebody coming from a Judeo-Christian background, that karma is not supposed to be laden with judgment. It's not something that is pronounced to happen to you because of, like in Judeo-Christian sense, damnation is something that comes from God, whereas karma is meant more as a rule of the universe. Like, this is how things are, rather than something that, for example, the Buddha said, your bad karma is because of this, and therefore I say what happens. Like, this is less something the Buddha created and more something that he perceived.
It's good that you add that too, because this is an evidence-based argument. Whenever somebody does something bad, everybody has a bad time. And everybody has the evidence that the condition of their situation is bad. It's observable. And it's not something that someone has done to them. It's not something that some deity has pronounced upon them. It's rather, this is what happens when you just live and act in the world.
So one of the problems I have with this concept, which is why I brought it up, is I think it's very easy for us to think of this stuff in terms of, like, adult humans who get to make free choice and all this type of thing. But there's a lot of other types of suffering in this world. And there are lots of other situations where someone's suffering or whatever have you seems to not necessarily be deserved. And I struggle with this concept in terms of, like, a child is killed, abducted and killed at a very young age, all this type of thing. And then you approach that and you're kind of like, well, what did, this poor kid wasn't here long enough to do anything in order to deserve that sort of outcome. What happened there? That seems a bit odd. I guess I've always struggled with how does that, how do those things sort of get worked out? How does that work in the context of karma?
That's a very good question. There's two things that are going on there. In the example you bring up of the child who dies too young, remember that Buddhism believes in reincarnation. And so that child has past lives where, according to the Buddhists, he must or she must have done something evil, and dying young is some sort of karmic retribution. But the second thing that's going on here is exactly what might cause your reaction to this concept. It is that Buddhism sometimes sounds victim blamey. It sounds very victim blamey. It says that the reason why bad things are happening to you is because you, whether you know it or not, whether it happened even in this lifetime or not, have done something wrong. And that's why your life is like this. And that ranges from anything all the way from random bad acts of God happening. I use that term loosely and colloquially. Random natural disasters happening, or even being sick, being poor, being disabled, etc. Very victim blamey. But the side of it that is not victim blamey, that I don't want to sound like I'm being apologetic for it, but it is what's going on in Buddhism. In addition to the victim blaming, there's also the acknowledgement of one's own control over their own circumstances. By changing their perspective, their behavior, their approach, their worldview, they can make themselves have better circumstances, people who are subject to this karma. And it's a very difficult thing to do. And Buddhism is happy to acknowledge that. It's happy to acknowledge that, that if you are in a very, very bad circumstance, those circumstances kind of beget more bad circumstances, and thus changing your circumstances, especially if it's something that you don't have a lot of agency or control over, like chronic illness or disability, difficult, nearly impossible. But that speaks again to the reincarnation issue. If you change your circumstances now, you may not have some sort of better circumstance in this life, but if you accrue enough merit, then your next life might be better. And in that regard, there always is some sort of impetus to act better and to act according to the Buddhist morality. I'm not going to weigh in on whether it's the correct or incorrect morality, because that's a whole other discussion. But Buddhism does have a prescribed morality where these and those actions accrue good karma and those ones are bad karma. And we should do these ones and try to have good karma, and everything will be better. And if we do those and not the other ones, then it'll be good. But yeah, it's when you zoom in, it is very victim blaming. I'm happy to acknowledge anytime that this is a problem that Buddhism might often have with this doctrine of karma.
Buddhism is not a perfect religion. It has problems, and this is absolutely one of them. It's something that has to be acknowledged and understood. I think that this is an old religion, and a lot of it, not necessarily a lot, but a portion of its doctrines are just not compatible with modern ideas of morality and fair. Like, it's unfair is what this ends up sounding like, because of something I did in a past life, I've got this problem now. Like, that's not fair. I was not me when I was in that past life. So yeah, it's just what you're making is a valid criticism of the religion.
Well, yes, that's rather my point. My art mentor Jesse Jacobs and I used to have this discussion for years and years, and we both came to the same conclusion of all of this is, good, and we kind of like it until we get to this part. And I've had a long kind of back and forth with my astrologer who always is talking about, the hard and difficult parts of my karma and why that is, caused my life to be this way and all this type of thing. And I'm kind of like, which I appreciate his, insight and all this sort of thing. But it's also just kind of like, okay, that I did something bad in the past that I have no conscious awareness of now, and that explains why things are the way they are today. Well, that's unfortunate, I guess. Like, I wish I had a time machine so I could go back and reform this person,
right.
Causing a lot of problems here, sort of thing. Yeah. So
I'm right there with you.
Yeah, that just seems to be a very difficult sort of thing to comprehend and to deal with and to understand and accept at this level in this time in this way. So that hence why I brought it up, because I think that's something that people don't necessarily understand.
I would agree completely. And I think that if you were to ask a Buddhist on the street, let's say, you find a Buddhist monk in a temple in East Asia, and, someone who has a disability or someone who is sick or poor or has some sort of bad circumstances goes to them, that person, that monk, is not going to say, sucks to suck, it's your fault, go home. So I like to think, or I like to hope that in most cases, though the doctrine is pretty heartless, that people are not going to be. I would hope that on the ground in person, these people would rather lean into like the let's try and make your circumstances better together, rather than the, you should have been less terrible in a past life, even though you had no idea that you lived before and that you did all these things. And that's why this is happening to you now. I would hope that they're a little bit more compassionate, because that's emphasized very strongly, is the compassion aspect.
For what it's worth, in my experiences interacting with Buddhists since I've started becoming interested in Buddhism, I have received both versions of that judgment, but the compassionate version is much more common.
Well, that's fortunate for you. I don't get much compassion out of my astrologer. It's no, it was when I first started working with him, I was telling him about my past and all this type of thing, and he's kind of like, well, yeah, in your childhood you were clearing out a lot of old hard karma and all this sort of thing, but you've done it now. And so, that's good. That's all cleaned out. So now things will kind of dramatically improve. And I'm kind of like, I probably should feel positively about you having said that. And yet somehow I don't.
It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good.
Yeah, like somehow I'm just not getting what I'm supposed to be getting out of this. Not quite sure why, but it's just not firing for me. And so it's kind of one of those conundrums that I have looked at from other people's perspectives and then also from my own. And yes, I realize that compassion is an important part of that, but it's my guy's a Buddhist out of the 70s. I think they missed that memo. But on the subject of compassion, though, that is a very important part of it all. How does that work in a Buddhist context as opposed to the Judeo-Christian, which we're all much more familiar with?
That's a good question. There's lots of different acts of compassion that are all different in their own way in terms of what the doer is doing. But I think that you'll find that many of these religions they've kind of co-evolved this concept. It mostly plays out in almsgiving. It mostly plays out in some sort of self-sacrifice or some sort of giving up of a material item or material food or something that you owned so that somebody else's circumstances can be better. In the case of karma, this is one of the ways that you accrue good karma. And compassion is not encouraged, it's necessary. So it's not like you can pass the test without doing that part. You actually have to do compassion regularly, constantly, in order to accrue enough good karma to transcend karma altogether. But there's different kinds of compassion, and they can be sacrifice of the body, sacrifice of food you have, sacrifice of material items you own, of property, of whatever. They could be the giving of knowledge, even the giving of truth. But it's quite similar to Judeo-Christian ideas where the important thing is just to give, be charitable and generous.
It's also worth talking about how this interacts with the idea of non-self. So at the highest levels, we're talking about people who are monks or otherwise very devoted Buddhists who have meditated on this idea of non-self. If you have no self, then you cannot act selfishly. So that's the idea that they're going through, is that by overcoming this idea of the self, you transcend selfishness. And also by trying to resist selfishness, by, even if you haven't realized this idea of non-self, by giving of yourself, you get closer to that idea.
It's important to note that there is selfish giving in Buddhism, and that is bad karma. Because just like he was saying, you've not realized non-self appropriately. So in that regard, selfish giving for the improvement of your own circumstances, maybe instrumentally or mechanically giving because you know that it's good karma and you want yourself to have a better rebirth, completely wrong perspective, and just leads you deeper into the hole of bad karma. True selfless giving is a realization of non-self. And true giving is not done for the giver, for the receiver, or for the thing being given. And so there kind of is like a correct and incorrect way, like he's saying. And the incorrect way is bad karma.
No, I think that's a very interesting idea. However, there's a term you have used about self and non-self, and I know that is another sort of tentpole idea with ego death and all this sort of thing. That's a very important part of Buddhism and all this sort of thing. Why don't you walk us through why the self and the individual is de-emphasized in Buddhism?
Absolutely. So in Buddhism, there's samsara and nirvana. Samsara is where we are now. It's a dog eat dog world, and we're stuck in it. There's suffering everywhere. There's unpleasantness everywhere. There's vulgarity everywhere. There's badness everywhere. Nirvana is not heaven. It's not all goodness. It's actually the absence of good or bad, because samsara also has joy, euphoria, all of the range of human experiences, and nirvana transcends those. So samsara is suffering and badness and vulgarity and all that stuff, but it's also euphoria and joy and attachment in any of its forms, whether it feels good or not. And the reason why that's samsara and not nirvana, even if there is euphoria in it, is that those feelings, euphoria or sorrow or sadness or anger or any of the range of human experiences we have, those replicate a delusion that we have a self. And they do so because they work with desire. We always, consciously or unconsciously, have a desire for good and a desire for the absence of bad, the presence of good and the absence of bad. And that desire is insatiable. And it's a human thing. It's a very human condition that we all have. We can eat, but never, ever be full for more than 6 hours. We can drink, but never, ever not be thirsty for more than a few hours. We can experience absolute pure joy at something that's happened, but then we'll be sad again later. We can have, X amount of days without sadness or sorrow or depression, but eventually we will have sadness, sorrow, depression. And in that regard, this suffering that we use as a term in Buddhism is actually a bad translation. The Sanskrit word dukkha actually it's better translated as something like dissatisfactoriness.
I would say anxiety.
Yeah, and the anxiety that what you have now will turn bad or go away, or something you don't have and don't want will come your way. The dissatisfactoriness and the anxiety that goes along with that, it perpetuates this delusion. And it's a delusion because we can observe in the world that everything is always changing, always changing. We might be able to observe relative continuity. For example, I have the same teeth as when I was born 24 years ago, but I won't always. Those teeth will fall out either while I'm alive or after I die, and they'll turn into dirt, and that dirt will turn into plants, and those plants will turn into food. There's a whole cycle. And at no point can you say my teeth are the plants or the dirt. And at no point can you say that the plants or the dirt are teeth, right? So you can tell by that there is no permanent, unchanging something in that cycle, even if there is like a period where similar begets similar. It's always going through this change. And so this desire that we have for a permanent self is only going to cause more desire for a permanent self. And it's a disagreement with the true nature of reality. And so it's de-emphasized. The idea is to overcome this delusion of self and this delusion that you have a soul, that you have something permanent and unchanging about you, that you have anything really at all. The biggest, I think, unconscious delusion about self that we have is that self is body. And that might be informed by our, like our Cartesian dualism, our Western philosophy, where we think of ourselves as a mind that possesses a body. But Buddhism has a lot of meditations about your body is not your own, or your body is a rotting corpse, or it's just meat with electricity in it, or it's actually just a petri dish for all the trillions of bacteria, viruses, and parasites that live on you. And all of these are meant to break your own attachment and your own desire to your body as self. And there's meditations like this for things external to the body as well, which their purpose, again, also is to break your attachment to this delusion that your zoomed in perspective where you see relative continuity, it breaks down the idea that equals into permanence or consistency or substantiality in any way.
Another thing, which I don't think we've actually done an episode about this yet, Nick, we should probably get on it, is the idea of interconnectedness. So, the
Absolutely.
original question was about non self. Well, another reason that there is no self is because we're also connected to everything around us. This is what's being spoken about in the story of Indra's net, which I heard about before I started studying Buddhism. I'm not sure if it's a common analogy for people outside of my weird sense of curiosity to come by, but it's basically this whole story where they're building up this picture of a net that's made out of jewels, and these jewels each reflect one another. And so within the reflection of the jewel to the left is the reflection of the jewel to that jewel's left. And basically, through this cascading series of reflections, it's revealed that actually, no, the net is just one jewel. And that's the idea of interconnectivity, the idea that we should be thinking not in terms of self, but in terms of humans or humanity, or even going further than that, as a living thing. And so that is the other way that the individual and the self is de-emphasized by both, like Nick was talking about before, saying that there is no permanent self, but also that there is not the division between myself and another self is an illusion. Did I get that right, Nick?
Absolutely. Yeah, that
Okay.
was 100% correct. This interdependence is like a causal relationship, right? The individual one person has two parents and they have four parents, and on and on and on, just all showing that my individual self is actually thousands, millions of people going back lots of long time and going forward a very long time, all breaking down this sense of individuality, because causality doesn't have individuality. There's no room for individuality. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense with karmic causality.
So there's a couple things here. One is when it comes to the individual, I get the kind of de-emphasis of all that there, but I think there's also sort of this odd idea of wanting to leave permanence and continuity behind in favor of interconnectedness. Why do you think that's important? And because I look at it as it only makes sense to look for permanence and continuity and a certain amount of statism. It's very convenient in the first. I think, it kind of reduces suffering, all this type of thing. And I think, the trajectory of our civilization here in the West, at least since, the Middle Ages, has been trying to, create good, decent material conditions for people. That certainly has been true of the last 300 years. And that is kind of a very important sort of thing. So why would we be compelled to give up that in favor of being subject to cycles and seasons and all these other forces outside of ourselves?
The primary reason is that as hard as we may look for permanence or try to create permanence, we will not find it and we will not be able to make it. This is kind of not even a Buddhist argument anymore. You can't make anything that's going to outlast the universe. You can't have anything inside the universe that is not of the universe. And thus, because the universe is always changing and theoretically at least has a beginning or an end, there can't be anything with it that does not have a beginning or an end. And we have an overwhelming preponderance of evidence around us that this is the case. People are born and die and then turn into dust. And then that dust is in the cycle somehow. It's in the plant cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle. It's in the cycle somehow. And At no point while it's in that cycle can you say, yeah, that was Nick over there. That little speck of dust is Nick, and there's a few more billion of them over there. I'm not the dust, and I'm not Nick. And that's kind of the upshot of striving towards a realization of the true nature of reality as not having any sort of permanence. They argue that to think any differently about reality is delusion. Now, you bring up an important point, which is the material conditions of the last 300 years. Would a Buddhist be opposed to modern medicine? Would a Buddhist be opposed to clean food and stable shelter and clean water? The answer is actually no. They would not be opposed to those things, because those are not thought of as trying to establish permanence. They're thought of as trying to support mindfulness, trying to support someone on their karmic journey. And even if they are done out of, this lizard brain desire that we all have to continue to stay alive, it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, because we have to be people. We have to be human beings. We're very lucky to be human beings because we are the most equipped to understand this nature of reality. All of what I'm saying is what the Buddhists argue. They say that the human beings, not the bugs or the animals or the demons or the abiotic, the human beings are the ones that have access to this truth and therefore should pursue it, because we have the right amount of knowledge and the right amount of agency. And so because it's observable, because we can see this happening around us, we should go with it rather than try and fight against it. It's a means of not dominating circumstances, but rather making the best of them and living in them, because these circumstances, they're, like in Buddhism, like they say, it's a universal truth. It's a universal reality of things that you can't really escape.
Going on with that idea of not really being able to escape, to that original question of not wanting to not be involved in cycles and all of this, I think the standard Buddhist answer would be, you're in it whether you want to or not. Like, that's not something that's up to us. Yeah. So that, like, it's by understanding this idea of cycles and impermanence and emptiness and all of that, you are better able to go with the flow as far as the different turns that, samsara, the realm of desire, is going to throw at us. So I think a less tactful version would be that now that I say that, I'm not sure tactful is the right version. A more blunt way to say this would be that, the whatever you are looking at that makes one think that they're not part of this realm of impermanence and cycles and all of that, that thing that is making you think that is a delusion that is harming you by keeping you from being able to see what's actually happening, which is this impermanent cycle.
Absolutely. We just did an episode about a very famous parable called the parable of the burning house. And in this parable, in one of the sutras, the burning house, this house that's on fire, represents this realm of desire that we're talking about. And there are people trapped in that house. There's children trapped in that house, but they don't know that the house is on fire. And so the idea is, if you know that the house is on fire, you're more likely to get out of it. If you don't know that it's on fire, you're more likely to get burned. And I think that's a very simple way to answer the question of, like, well, why try to get out? It's because it's on fire. And if you don't get out, first you have to know it's on fire. And if you don't know it's on fire, then you're going to just be burned in it.
No, I think that makes sense. I think my problem begins that I am not a huge fan of reality for a variety of reasons. And so, when everyone, comes along and is kind of like, oh, it's just cycles, just go with the flow, like things are going to happen, just deal with it, all this type of thing, I'm kind of like, I am tired. Okay. I am an elder millennial. Reality has not been kind, and I am exhausted.
Everything I was told in school was wrong.
Yes, yeah, and every conception of the world that we had and we grew up with could not be less relevant to how we live today.
Right.
Which I think is a very difficult thing. And I tell people, I said, part of the problem with our modern age is it moves at a pace unfamiliar to humans of the past. If you took someone from the year 1700 and dropped them in the year 1800, they would find life to be fairly similar.
Yeah.
Clothes would have changed, all this type of thing, but the material everyday conditions of life wouldn't have changed that much. Give them a couple weeks, they would be able to figure it out. If you took someone from the year 1800 to the year 1900,
they'd have no idea.
They would have a much more difficult time. If you took someone from the year 1900 and brought them to today, they would have a psychotic breakdown.
Right.
Absolutely.
So that is something where, our society moves so much faster than like humanity is able to keep up with. And so I think that when you get into that whole thing of like everything that you grew up with doesn't apply anymore, where do you go from here? It leaves you with a certain unmoored sort of feeling, because it's not easy to go back and undo that or redo that or make all those adjustments or whatever have you. So I don't necessarily find the whole go with the flow thing to be a compelling argument for life. Because to me, it just leaves you with nothing you can depend on. And then what have you got? You've got less than nothing.
Well, there's two ways to think about that in Buddhism. The first is that the unmoored feeling, the feeling of being floating around and kind of lost in all of this, is actually a wholesome mindset in Buddhism. I know it doesn't feel good. I don't feel good in it either at all.
Neither do I.
Because we crave stability and substantiality and consistency more than we crave anything. Especially, as you say, as human material conditions, the rate of change has accelerated such now that there's just absolutely you can't place any bets at all. They're all off, but this is a wholesome perspective, because once you start to have this sort of distaste for reality, you're starting to understand that the fire is hot, if that makes sense. If we go back to the burning house metaphor, this first initial distaste for how things go is your first step into recognizing the very first truth of Buddhism. All things, all life, all existence, everything is dukkha, dissatisfactoriness, upsetness, anxiety, pain, all kinds of problems. And so that's a very tough truth. It's a very horrible, not comforting truth. It's a lot of people get stuck on that one. And if they don't get stuck on that one, they get stuck on the second one, which is that this suffering is caused by your desire for substantiality and consistency and stability. It's very easy to get stuck there. But note that those are only the first couple of steps. You go further down that path and come to see that there is an end to this sort of like nasty circumstance we have. There is an end to how bad everything is and how bad everything feels. And that end, according to Buddhism, is this Buddhist path. In the case of the Four Noble Truths, which I've been listing off, they are the Eightfold Path, which has to do with belief and view and speech, action, livelihood, mindfulness, concentration, all the ones we're familiar with. There's different perspectives and different schools of Buddhism as to how to deal with that. But ultimately, this is all about contemplation. It's all about study. It's all about meditation. And it's all about attainment of wisdom as to the true nature of reality, which we've all started to do, sitting here realizing like, hey, actually, we can't take anything for granted. And if we do, we're just going to end up with nothing. And if we are stuck on, in that position, acknowledging that we can't make any bets and can't take anything for granted, then we have less than nothing. We have to go just a little bit further than that and start to and start to fill that emptiness with meaning somehow. And that meaning in Buddhism becomes saving people, making other people's circumstances better, helping people, sharing in sharing whatever you have, and partaking of what other people share with you. It's all very utopian and very hold hands and sing kumbaya, but this is religion we're talking here. They're going to be that way. And so the comfort, I guess, the existential comfort that Buddhism has to offer is that things suck, but temporarily. And so if you're feeling like, the entire, even if this period in life, the entire circumstance of our material world is just changing beyond anything we can comprehend, and it's continuing to spinning out is temporary, and our feelings about it spinning out are temporary. And so we can, luckily, very luckily, we're not stuck anywhere, and we have agency as to where to go next. And the Buddhist path prescribes that where we go next is somewhere positive, somewhere that makes our life better and someone else's life better, other people's lives better. And we really find that the only things that we can rely on, the only things that do make sense and give us consistency, stability, meaning, even if it is in a provisional sense, even if it is in an impermanent and kind of fleeting sense, the things that do give us those things are like giving and meditating and, trying to find stillness in the middle of the chaos. I think that's what Buddhism serves for a lot of people in the West, at the very least, who are going through tough times. I think that it came at a very opportune time to the US for it to become very popular. In the 1960s and 70s, not only was there the Vietnam War going on, but there was also economic troubles due to oil crises and whatnot. And even though looking back on it now, it seems like those were the simpler times, for the people living in them, it was quite uncertain. I'm sure they thought it was just as uncertain as we think our times are now. Now, we can't go back and say, you have no idea what you're in for. It's going to get way worse. But I think that Buddhism arriving in the United States during the 60s, 70s, 80s helped to offer some comfort to people who were going through those circumstances in the United States and thinking like, wow, I have no idea if, the entire circumstance of the United States is going to be taken over by the Red Scare or some other stupid crap. Or if they think that, gas prices are going to go up to $4 a gallon and I'm not going to be able to put bread on the table. I think that it helped those people in some significant kind of way. Although it had to do so by transforming into something that it was not when it was in East Asia.
To the original criticism regarding going with the flow, I don't want to misconstrue Buddhism as a passive religion.
That's also very true.
When you see Buddhist monks sitting and meditating, they're not doing nothing. They are very active in their minds. And Buddhism is when we're talking about going with the flow, that is specifically regarding the aspects of samsara that we can't control. But there are things we can control, and that's generally prescribed by the Eightfold Path. And so by taking control of those things, you both have the power of self-determination, like you are in control of where you're going. Buddhism has a path that it prescribes to walk on, like it's an active participation, but also it acknowledges that there are parts of it that we can't control and advocates to accept those as best as we can, basically.
I had the chance to hear the Dalai Lama give a talk in New York City back in 2012, I think it was. And whenever he was, the one thing I remember from that whole entire talk, the single thing, he was talking a lot about a lot of different complicated Buddhist things that I was frankly too young to appreciate at the time. But the one thing that always stuck with me is if you do not have control, there is no use for worry. But if you do have control, there is no need for worry. Meaning that worry doesn't help if you don't have control. You don't work, like being anxious and upset doesn't kind of fix being anxious and upset. And if you have fixed being anxious and upset, then there is no need to be anxious and upset. Or if you have a way to fix it. And Buddhism, like Paradox is saying, gives you a way to fix it. And it may or may not work for everybody, but it's like he says, it's a prescribed path that requires active participation.
No, that certainly makes sense. There's obviously this conversation could go on for a very long time because y'all have a whole podcast about it, and we've reached an hour, and I think we fried the brains of our listeners well enough. So they'll be ruminating on these topics for the rest of the day whenever they're listening to this. So why don't you give us some information about where to find you guys online, where to access the podcast, all that sort of thing. And so that way, when people recover from this conversation, they can go consume more of it.
It gets dense, by the way, just for warning. Like if this seems brain frying, man, once we do episodes about the sutras specifically, and that's where things get really dense. But let's talk about our social media. Nick, what you got?
Yeah, so you can find our podcast, Bright on Buddhism, on all of the major platforms. And if you have a question that you would like us to discuss, you can tweet us at Bright Buddhism. You can email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. You can join our Discord server, which is called the Hidden Sangha. Sangha is a Buddhist word, Sangha, and find us on there. There's lots of different ways to engage with us and find our podcast and check us out.
I will provide links, so hopefully in the description, like we can, if you want to find us on Discord, there should be a link in this description.
Yes. No need to write all that down. If you were trying to frantically write, there'll be links in the description. So we definitely do that so people don't have to write stuff down. So, well, thank you both for coming onto the Cameron Journal podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.